Thank you very much. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to share with you one of my passions in life, being assessment centers, and specifically using assessment centers for developmental purposes. So I'm very passionate about that, and I hope by the end of this presentation that I would have ignited some of the passion inside you as well. What I'm going to share with you in this time that we've got available is the distinction between the different type of assessment centers, and then the differences between the various types of centers. I will make out a case for development assessment centers, and then very specifically the case for coaching development centers. I will continue by touching on the return on investment for coaching development centers, and I will end off by just quickly sharing with you examples of coaching development center results. And these are results that I've gathered over the years because I have been using coaching centers for quite some time. So let's start off with the types of assessment centers. There are three different types of assessment centers, or rather different purposes that an assessment center can be used for. Now, I think most people are familiar with using assessment center for selection purposes, and it's either for selection into an organization or selection into a specific position, or even selection into a specific program. Another purpose that assessment centers can be used for is obviously for diagnostic purposes, and it's diagnostic in the sense of diagnosing a person's current areas of strengths or current areas of development, and it can be used at an individual level in order to draw up a development plan for the individual after the center, or it can be used at a team level, or it can even be used at organizational level to determine the organizational culture and actually to influence or impact organizational culture. So the deliverable of a diagnostic center is usually a profile indicating areas of strengths and areas needing development. The third purpose for which an assessment center can be used is obviously a development assessment center. Now, a development assessment center is what I call a two-in-one. It is a valid assessment of the person's current competence, and in addition, it is a development intervention. So training and learning takes place at or during the development center itself. The three types of centers must not be confused with the technology being used to deliver or administer an assessment center. All three types of centers can either be delivered in person in the traditional way of assessment centers, or it can be delivered making use of some sort of technology, and then we call it a TEAC, a Technology Enhanced Assessment Center. An example of that, for instance, would be where the written material is delivered via the internet, while the group discussions are taking place in person. And then we've got virtual assessment centers, where virtual assessment centers, most of the various aspects of the assessment center are then delivered using technology. As an example, the participant can log into a platform, receive all the simulation materials, the participants' responses are captured on the platform, all the role plays take place on the platform, and afterwards the assessment done by the assessors can be done on the platform, and a report is automatically generated. So the use of technology can be applied irrespective of what type of center is being used. So I would like to focus on the differences between the various types of centers. And let's start with an assessment center used for selection purposes. So the critical question that organizations want answered when they use assessment center for selection purposes is, can this candidate actually do what they say they can do? Can they, in other words, walk their talk? Now, this is very critical because a lot of the time on paper, a candidate looks like the ideal candidate. Or even when you do an interview with the candidate is very good verbally and orally, can sell themselves very well, and you think this is the ideal candidate for the position. Yet the moment you put the person in the actual job situation, it's a different story. And that is what an assessment center for selection purposes can tell you. It can actually show you, can this person do what they say that they can do. Now, the benefits of using an assessment center for selection purposes are manifold. First and foremost, it is a fair selection process. If it is applied in a standardized way consistently for all the candidates. There is also enough research to show that assessment center results do predict job performance results. So there are a lot of evidence in terms of construct validity as well as predictive validity. What I like most about using assessment centers for selection purposes is the rich information you receive about every candidate. You sit with so much additional information that you cannot deem from just an interview or just psychometric tests, that you then can use to compare the various candidates with each other. It is a legal defensible selection method if it is executed ethically and in a standardized way. So in South Africa, but I know elsewhere in the world as well, legal defensibility is very, very important. From a candidate's perspective, an assessment center provides a good preview of the job that they've applied for. And I've personally been involved in centers where after a candidate has been through the assessment center, then withdraws from the selection process, saying that if this is what the job is all about, they're not interested in actually further pursuing it. And that is excellent that you can sift out this type of misperceptions early in the talent management process. And then if it's a well-executed center, then from an organizational macro level, it does enhance the brand image of the organization. Now, when you start using assessment centers for developmental purposes, you basically want to know, based on this person's unique needs, what development does this person need to be more effective? Or how can this employee be prepared for a future role? So you really want to see how you can tailor the specific development interventions for the specific person. Now, once again, the benefits of using assessment centers for developmental purposes are manifold. The top one there, it provides a profile of strengths and development areas that can lead to unique, tailored, and the word that I sometimes hate is bespoke development plan for an individual. From an organization's perspective, it allows organizations to target development interventions and therefore to make sure that there is more return on investment, because now it's not everyone must attend the same training. You target the training to the specific needs of the individual. If it is a properly executed center and the participant receives effective feedback, then it leads to improved participant self-insight. And if it is effective feedback, then chances are as well that the participant engagement in implementing a development plan would be more. And this is huge because we find that a lot of times participants do not implement development plans because they don't see the benefit, or why must I implement it? Whereas if they received proper feedback, that engagement is there. And then the last big benefit is that there are developmental payoffs for assessors, line managers who are assessors during a development assessment center. And there is research that shows that line managers that are assessors are better equipped to deliver performance management sessions or performance appraisal interviews inside the organization. So there are numerous benefits. Now, the big mistake that people make is they think they can design an assessment center, let's say for selection purposes, and then also use it for developmental purposes. But that is a thinking mistake, because you need to design the assessment center with the specific purpose that you have in mind. And the reason why that's crucial is there are deeper differences between the various types of centers than just the terminology. There are differences in terms of different competencies. So when you design a center for selection purposes, you're going to focus more on more stable competencies. Whereas the moment it is for developmental purposes, then per definition, and in order to be fair to the participants, you're going to focus on competencies that can be developed. And also it's important that the participants must perceive it to be developable competencies or focal areas. There is a different process involved in terms of how you structure a center for selection versus a center for developmental purposes. There are different skill sets for the assessors that's required. And later on, this will become apparent during the presentation when I highlight the role of an assessor during a development assessment center. Different duration. It is so that the selection center is much shorter than a full-blown development assessment center, and it's because of the difference in the process that's taking place. Obviously different deliverables, because at a center for selection purposes, you are aiming to get to an overall assessment rating, and you are probably going to rank order all the candidates that has been through the process. Whereas during a diagnostic center, you want profiles of areas of strengths and areas needing development, and at the development assessment center, it's a full-blown development plan that you want, as well as the delegate must walk away with notes and insights into their own abilities. And then obviously there are different post-center processes that will take place. Important to take note that the purpose of the center is going to impact the stakeholder expectations. So at a center for selection purposes, the stakeholders, one being the client, just wants an answer, who's the most appropriate person that I need to appoint, versus at a development assessment center, the question that they want answered is what development is required. Also, the perception or the expectations from the participants will be different depending on the type of center. I've referred to the competencies being different, and I've referred to more stable competencies for selection purposes versus more developmental or developable competencies at a development assessment center. And here is an example of what I mean with it. If you look at the example of a stable competency, an ability to work with complexity in an unstructured environment. Now, if you read that competency, it sounds difficult to develop, and it will probably take longer for a person to develop that competency because it's more a cognitively loaded competency, and it's more to do with how the person structures data and how they process data. Versus if you look on the other side of the screen, developable competency, ability to establish clear priorities, to schedule activities to ensure optimum use of time and resources, and to monitor performance against objectives. If you read the competency, it sounds easier to develop. You can actually see what you need to focus on in order to develop this competency. So this is an example of a competency that can usually be addressed during the center itself, and if not during the center in full, then in a very short period after a center. And this is what we say, the distinction in terms of stable versus developable competencies for the different types of centers. If you look at the participant experience, the participant experience of an assessment center for selection and also a center for diagnostic purposes will probably be something like the process that I've indicated. There will be an introduction and a brief orientation that the candidates or participants will be exposed to. Then they will participate in the simulations and complete all the assessments. And if it is a diagnostic center, then they would receive feedback afterwards and they would receive developmental suggestions. If it is for selection purposes, this feedback and development suggestions are very limited that the person is going to receive afterwards. So you see the process of a selection center and a diagnostic center is a shortened process, and it's pretty much the people come in, they do what they need to do, and they walk away. The same is true for the assessors. The assessors are there. They are there to observe, record, classify, and evaluate, and they write reports, and then they withdraw from the process. I like to call it a more cold clinical interaction that takes place. Now, what is the difference with a development assessment center? Well, with a development assessment center, remember it's a 2-in-1. So organizations' requirements for assessment centers that have a developmental purpose is they want to change participant behavior, because at the end of the day, that's the ultimate goal of all types of development that takes place. They also want participants to take ownership of their own development. I mean, no organization, definitely in 2021, no organization wants to babysit their own employees to develop. The newest trends that has come out in reports like with the Joss Bersin reports and McKinsey reports is more and more organizations will expect employees to do self-directed learning, to take ownership and to develop themselves. And then participants should implement their agreed upon development plans. Once again, they don't want to babysit employees in terms of preparing themselves for the future. So during a development assessment center, the structure or the process would be something like participants would attend a very in-depth orientation, because they need to be cognitively prepared and emotionally prepared as to what will happen during the center that they're attending. Then they would probably do the first block of simulations or assessments. It can be an in-basket, it can be a role play, it can be a group discussion. Then there's a break, and during the break, your assessors will do the data integration that needs to happen, and they will make notes in terms of the feedback that they can give to participants. What participants do during the so-called break, usually it is a session that's facilitated by a trainer in terms of training them on some specific aspect. Then the participants receive detailed feedback about the behavior linked to the competencies, linked to the simulations. And here is the big difference. Immediately after that feedback, they do block 2 of the simulations of the assessments. And it's usually parallel assessments or simulations that they do. Parallel, meaning it's at the same level of complexity, but it's different content. And then once again, after that process, then the participants would again receive detailed feedback and coaching as to what needs to happen further. So that is what happens during a development assessment center. Now, I am a proponent of coaching development centers. So I say we can optimize that whole process and we can take it one step further. And the reason why that is important for me is behavior change needs to take place on 3 different levels. Yes, what we see is the behavioral change, is the visible behavior, but there are lots of things that need to happen and take place before the visible behavior becomes habit, before it becomes something that can be sustained. And that is what's below the surface. So there needs to be, on a cognitive level, a change that needs to take place, and on an emotional level as well. Now, I'm not 100% sure whether the emotions precede the cognitive or the cognitive precedes the emotions. I do know the 2 levels are extremely powerful. And I'm talking first and foremost about a person's emotional reaction that needs to take place. Then a person's mindsets that needs to change. And then the person needs to learn the certain knowledge and certain skills. And all of that takes time for it to actually happen. So therefore, at a coaching development center, the process is that a participant will participate in a simulation. Then directly after the simulation, the participant would attend what's called a debrief session. Now, the debrief session is usually a group discussion that's being facilitated. And during this group discussion, the participants share with each other how they've experienced the simulation that they've just been through. Now, this is critical because a lot of times participants feel as though the way that they've reacted to something is the only possible way that you can deal with this. But during this debrief, when they start talking to the other participants, they realize, but it's been the same data that we've been presented, but that person did this and that person did that. So already learning takes place, learning from each other. So it's also, it taps into what we call social learning that happens during the debrief. Then after the debrief, each participant then sits with their coach assessor, and the coach assessor then provides very specific feedback and very specific coaching to the participant based on the behavior that they've just observed. Now, this is very important because the coaching that happens here is where the coach must make sure that they work through the emotions to the cognitive level, to the visible behavior level, so that this person's insights can be on all three levels. After the coaching session, there's some time for the participant to do some self-reflection where they reflect on their discussion that they just had. They set goals for themselves. They, in my coaching centers, I usually help them or assist them to work through a toolbox to learn certain techniques. And then we repeat the whole process again, where the participant then again participates in a simulation, debrief, coach, and we go through that process a few times during a coaching development center itself. So the learning process that takes place during a coaching development center is, the first step is obviously the delegate participating in the simulation. So the person first experiences the situation. Then after that, the learning takes place in terms of the immediate discussion with the other participants, the immediate feedback that happens, and the immediate coaching that happens. Then that learning is then reinforced because the participant needs to apply the new learning in the next simulation, and they need to transfer the learning from this simulation to the next simulation. And we do that process a few times so that that transfer takes place at least 2 or 3 times during a center, and then hopefully afterwards it can also take place. Now, you've heard that I'm talking about an assessor coach during a coaching development center. And that is quite a huge difference between a center for selection purposes or even for diagnostic purposes versus a coaching development center. Your assessor at a coaching development center needs to be a competent, qualified coach, certified coach, as well as a competent certified assessor that can observe, record, classify, and evaluate behavior. So if we look at what role this coach assessor fulfills during a coaching center, first and foremost, they need to prepare for the simulation like an ordinary assessor. And during the simulations, they observe, record, classify, evaluate, or what I call here once, they observe, note, classify, and evaluate behavior. They also co-assess participant behavior during simulations and after simulations. Now, this is another crucial part of a coaching development center. When I facilitate these types of centers, I explain to participants that we don't do things to them as participants. We are totally transparent, and they as participants fully participate in the process of evaluation of their own behavior. So literally, remember, the participant has just been part of a group discussion, a group debrief session. Now, the moment they go and sit down with their own coach assessor, the coach assessor literally opens the scoring rubric in front of the participant, and the participant and the coach assessor together complete the scoring rubric. Now, this is very critical in terms of adult learning, because now the participant can see, oh, I said that I've said, or that I've done is linked to this competency, and specifically this behavioral anchor in this competency. And this is how the rating scale works in terms of determining whether that behavior is effective or not effective. So there and then, not only does the participant get insight into their own behavior, but they also learn about the competencies and the behavior linked to the competencies. Once again, remember I've said that behavior change is a cognitive, emotional, and behavioral process. So during this discussion, it might be that the participant goes into emotional reaction. They go into defense mechanisms, and the moment that happens, we know that the delegate or the participant is no longer listening. So here is where the coaching skill of the coach assessor comes in, where the coach needs to work through all that emotion so that the participant calms down and the participant can interact with the information on a cognitive level so that learning actually takes place. The coaching is also part of the coaching is also to help the participant identify how they can approach this situation differently next time. Then also part of the role of the coach assessor is really to assist the participant to draw up a development plan. And we say that the coach assessor is the catalyst for the participant to learn, plan, and do goal setting. Now, the role of the participant, you've heard, is no longer a passive role. They also are actively involved in this whole process. So not only do they prepare for simulations and they participate in simulations, they also co-assess their own behavior during simulations and after simulations, and they are therefore actively learning. They plan, they set goals, and they draw up their own development process. So we move the participant also from being passive or a semi-passive in the sense of they just participate in the simulations during an assessment center for selection, to where they actually co-create their own learning process. So In terms of making a case out for coaching development centers, important is that during a coaching development center, participants write their own final report and development plan. So again, we give that accountability to the participant. Yes, the coach assessor facilitates that, and yes, the coach assessor is the final accountable person for it to be accurate and it to actually be comprehensive. But it is crucial that the participant actually does that, because it's part of the learning process. The Coaching Development Center is 100% in line with Kolb's learning spiral. If we look at the learning spiral, the participant has a pre-understanding of how to do things. So let's say the first simulation is a one-on-one role play, a discussion with a subordinate. So the participant has some sort of understanding of how to do this. Then the participant has the encounter. In other words, the participant participates in the simulation. The participant has this discussion then with the subordinate in this fictitious organization. Then the participant interprets their encounter through their own feelings and knowledge. And that is what happens during the debrief session. Participants would say, oh, this was very unrealistic and it was so hard and it was so difficult. And this is how I personally have dealt with the situation. So it's their own interpretation. Then discuss with someone, which is the coach, and then the new understanding is created. So by following the process of a coaching development center, we are totally in line with the adult learning principles as described by Kolb. What is very important, and what's the big difference between a diagnostic center, a development assessment center, and specifically a coaching center, is the issue of feedback. Feedback to development center participant is a crucial part of the whole process. Now, there is an assumption about feedback, and the assumption is that when you provide people with information about their own performance, that will result in improved performance. That is an assumption. Behind that assumption, or for that assumption to become reality, it depends on the extent to which the participant understands the feedback and the extent to which they actually agree with the feedback. If a person doesn't understand the feedback or cannot see why a certain competency needs development, then why would they then spend energy on trying to change their own behavior? It's only if they get it, it's only if they understand the competency and why it needs to change, that they will actually invest energy. The intent of feedback is to engage participants in appropriate developmental activities. So you want to move them into doing something in terms of changing their behavior. So they need to accept it and they need to act on it. Feedback should also be perceived as accurate, and participants should have motivation to use it. If it's not perceived as being accurate, then obviously why bother? It's not accurate, so why must I do anything about it? So the development or the feedback requirements for feedback to be effective, it must be detailed. And at the Coaching Development Center, it is detailed because the participant sits with his coach and the two of them work through the scoring rubric, behavioral element per behavioral element. It must be specific, and obviously that happens during a coaching development center. It must be high quality feedback. Well, again, if the assessor coach is a competent assessor coach who has comprehensive notes that links or classifies the behavior effectively, then it will be high quality. And there must be suggestions to change behavior, which is part of the coaching process. And remember, the assessment results impact on a cognitive level, an affective level, and a behavior level. And during an assessment center or a coaching development center, there is enough time for the coach to work through all 3 levels with the participant each time. So participants need to react to the feedback, and they need to understand it before they're actually going to do anything about it. So the advantage of the CDC is that participants have time to react to the feedback. They can work through their emotions, they can work through it at the cognitive level. The assessor coaches have got time to build the participant's self-efficacy. Again, there's enough evidence and enough published research to show that it is very important for participants to believe that they can show the behavior linked to a competency. And through the coaching centers and the various sessions, you work on the self-efficacy. Participants engage in evaluation and impact own development. So they feel as though they are in control. It's no longer someone else doing it to them. So if we compare the various types of centers with each other, an assessment center's purpose is to predict performance, but a diagnostic center is to diagnose the current levels of areas needing development and areas needing strengths. A development assessment center is to identify also the areas needing development and the areas of strength, but at the same time, it's a learning opportunity and it's an opportunity to draw up a development plan. A coaching development center, in addition, is an opportunity to accelerate the learning that's actually taking place. So there's an opportunity for individual coaching, accelerated learning. Then if we further look at the differences between the various types of centers, we have on the one side your more stable competencies or dimensions assessed by a center for selection purposes. And then on moving towards the development assessment center, it's more developable, where the competency or dimension can be developed at the center itself and then also in a short period after the center. At an assessment center, feedback is usually just to the hiring manager. In some circumstances, the candidates would also receive feedback, but during a diagnostic center, every participant receives feedback and the development plan, whereas at the development assessment center and at the coaching center, feedback takes place at multiple points during the process. At the selection center, there's an overall assessment rating that you're going for. The diagnostic center, it's a profile of strengths and development areas, whereas at the development assessment center and a coaching development center, it is the areas of development and immediate feedback as to what needs to change. So at the last two, at the development assessment center and a coaching development center, there's practice and learning that takes place at the center itself. At a coaching center, participants even write their own reports. And then there are development plans that's drawn up so that the development plans are unique and the development plans are actually tailored to the specific individual. So given that that's what happens during a coaching center and a development assessment center, how can you improve the chances that there is going to be a return on investment? Because let's be honest with each other. An assessment center, whether it's for selection purposes or whether it's for development purposes, costs money and there's a time investment. So how can we increase chances for a return on it? So the requirements for success is that your assessment center, whether it's for selection or whether it's for development, must be aligned to the organization's strategic objectives and strategic goals. So whatever the new after COVID-19 strategies and objectives of your organization will be ensure that there's a line of sight between the purpose and what the center is going to do versus what the organization sees strategically. Then there must be a direct alignment between the talent management strategy of the organization and the center itself. And then also remember, a center, whether it's for selection purposes or whether it's for development purposes, will impact the climate of the organization as well as the culture. When it comes to the climate of an organization, if your existing climate in the organization is toxic, in other words, it's not very positive, then think carefully how you're going to implement a development assessment center and whether you should actually implement a development assessment center. Because your change management around handling the negativity in the organization might be more important than the use of the center. But remember, your center can be one instrument you use to turn around the climate and the culture in the organization. So the big thing is embed your assessment center in other processes. And the easiest process is embed it in your talent management processes and structures. So yes, obviously in terms of your selection processes, and usually an assessment center for selection is part of a multi-hurdle selection process, and usually towards the end part of the selection process. Yes, your career planning and management, and that's especially where your diagnostic centers can come in. And if you use it for succession management, I usually recommend that you use a selection center to select people that must go into your succession management pools. But once a person is in the pool, then I would say start using your coaching centers to tailor the learning journey of the people inside the pool. It can be used for performance management purposes and then obviously for learning and development. But what is important, design it as part of the processes, embed it as part of the processes. Here is an example of the growth framework, what I mean with embedding it into other processes. So typically, the first block there would be before a person attends a development assessment center or a coaching center, let the person do a 360-degree evaluation. So the person gets, or you obtain the feedback from the organization as how that person's behavior is perceived by colleagues. Then the person attends the center, then there's a development discussion, and then the development plan is implemented. Here is the big thing. From experience, I can tell you that to have return on investment for a development center, there needs to be follow-up discussions. And the follow-up discussions are usually every 6 to 8 months, depending on what's happening in the organization. And during a follow-up discussion, you again do a 360-degree evaluation, but you re-look the development or the implementation of a person's development plan post the center. Usually that needs to happen at 3 times before a development plan is fully implemented. And then it's time for a person to attend a parallel assessment center again, so that you can have the journey, the learning journey of the person throughout the implementation of their development plan. So this is just another picture showing how the development process works or looks like. The person would attend a center, then afterwards there's a feedback discussion, or what I call a development planning discussion, where the participants' line manager is involved, and you draw up a development plan. And the development plan must have day-to-day activities, but perhaps also projects, because what you want to do is you want to change a person's behavior into making it a habit, but you also want to look at a more macro level of how the person can apply the competencies. There's development development follow-up that needs to happen, and then it's time for a person to attend a next level center. In organizations, I usually structure your CDCs in terms of different levels, so that the person can have a continuous process of development, and in so doing, you build a very strong leadership culture in the organization. What's also important to remember is to remember the assessment center participant touch points. Now, the touch points are all the opportunities that a participant has to form perceptions about the experience of an assessment center. Traditionally, when we've implemented assessment centers, whether for selection purposes or whether for developmental purposes, we tend to ignore these touch points. But it's more and more important for us to look at participant experiences. And the participant experiences starts with when the person receives the invitation to participate in an assessment center, the registration process, the orientation process, the simulation instructions that they receive, participating in the simulations, the debriefs, the feedback, and even the development planning that happens and the implementation of the plan. In a research project that I was involved in around assessment center and ethics, this whole process was highlighted in terms of if this is not planned in detail and consciously, how it can go wrong and how a participant can go into stress levels even before a center, and then you can question the validity of the center results. I want to quickly share with you examples of assessment center results, and the first one that I want to share is qualitative feedback. So the pictures you see there are 3 participants who has attended a coaching development center a few years ago, and then a parallel coaching development center 3 years after the first center. And the lady at the top, Melanie, she said that the coaching development center had the greatest impact on her whole development process, because it took her out of her comfort zone, but it took her out in a safe environment. And her greatest takeaway was that a manager leader's role is to create direction, create environment where people can perform. Remember the mind shift that I referred to that needs to happen before you can get to effective leadership behavior. That is what she's referring to. Wimla, the second person there, she said it was about understanding the people we work with and the environment and the ability to rely on each other. So it helped her specifically to build her relationships and self-confidence and that whole self-efficacy at the end of the day. Sizwe at the bottom here, he recommended, or he said it was a great eye-opener for him because it made him aware of his own behavior and the impact that it had on the people around him. Interestingly enough, at the end of the whole development process, Sizwe participated in a national competition, manager-leader competition, judged by external judges, and he actually won that year as the best upcoming star, so to speak, in terms of being an effective manager leader. So, and he contributes him being able to win because of the mind shift and the behavior change as a result of the coaching development centers. Those of you who would like to see more tangible results, what you're looking at here is a center that we've implemented in an organization in 2012, some time ago. This organization, or this center, was a center specifically designed for trainers, professional trainers in a production environment. Now, in a production environment, if your training people are not fully competent. It's got a ripple effect in terms of the training that they deliver, and in terms of the competence levels of the employees working in the production environment. So to make a long story short, if the trainers are not competent in terms of what they're doing, it might lead to a situation where the production staff or employees are not competent in terms of being able to work with machinery, being able to fulfill their role on the production line. And what we monitored here was actually the incidence of the risk incidents, in other words, of accidents that actually happened. And we can see, whereas before we implemented the Coaching Development Center, it averaged 3039, and we brought that accident rate down to 1755 in a question of 12 months. So here it is an example of where we worked with hard facts, and the only change that was actually happening in that environment was the fact that we rolled out the Coaching Development Center. So Coaching Development Center, although it is, or some people can perceive it as something very woolly and something very fuzzy, it does impact the bottom line of an organization if it is well implemented and if it is well structured. So I've included a reference list here for you if you want to have a look at it, and that is the message that I want to leave with you. Perhaps the last thought, with COVID-19, the pandemic, and we being forced to work from home and people interaction being limited, I think the more we are forced to use technology, the more the need for people to have personal interaction. And that is exactly what the coaching center gives a person. It gives the person that personal touch, that personal message of, yes, all of this are generic training and development, but this is where I fit into this whole process, into this whole bigger picture. And that's the advantage of a coaching development center. High touch, but it can also still be high tech in the process. And that's my message.